And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Saturday morning's flying weather showing a lot of marginal VFR, Bering Sea, Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, IFR here over the eastern interior, right on down across the Copper River Basin to the eastern North Gulf Coast, then on down the southeast coast with some more over the eastern Gulf of Alaska, and marginal VFR up there over the western North Slope, Arctic coast down to the north shore of the Seward Peninsula. For the afternoon, not much change up that way. IFR now showing up there for the eastern Arctic coast on down across the Brooks Range. Marginal VFR south of that zone, and then from the Alaska Range on down to the eastern North Gulf Coast. IFR, that again extends down across the Panhandle. VFR continues, actually marginal VFR here into Prince William Sound, about holding for what will be in the morning hours. VFR, though, for the area south of the Alaska Range, western interior, northward there across the Kobuk and western Koyukuk Valley, but marginal VFR again, northern Seward Peninsula. Marginal VFR, much of the Bering Sea, as well as the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, on up into Kodiak Island to Kamishak Bay. That holds through Sunday morning. Marginal VFR, Kamishak Bay, Barents, down across Kodiak. No change out west, marginal VFR covering the Bering Sea, Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. VFR central west side, still some marginal VFR for the Seward Peninsula. And an area of IFR there for the eastern Arctic coast. The most IFR again will be here over the eastern North Gulf Coast and the Panhandle. And for the afternoon, that pattern continues. Marginal VFR with IFR for the southeast coast up to Yakutat, marginal VFR eastern central Copper River Basin, down in possibly to Valdez and Cordova eastward. And the Barren Islands, marginal VFR, but kind of improving here for Kodiak Island into the afternoon Sunday from the morning. And marginal VFR, central western Arctic coast, western North Slope, and just marginal VFR for the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. And for passes for the Brooks Range, Anaktuvuk and Adigan for Saturday, looking pretty marginal for both passes on either approach. Lake Clark and Merrill, good VFR again for Saturday as rainy and windy. But heading east, Isabel, conditions come down. We're looking at marginal VFR there. And then to IFR for Mentasta, Tanita VFR. Portage starting out marginal, becoming VFR at some point in the day, probably the afternoon, maybe earlier. Chilkoot and White, IFR. Freezing levels here, about 2,000 to 4,000 feet there across the southeast coast. And icing, look for considerable moderate rime icing here coming up into the eastern North Gulf Coast from the Gulf of Alaska in across mainly the northern Panhandle, but areas of that extending down all the way to Dixon Entrance. And taking a look at the jet stream, 33,000 feet. We've got general low pressure here over the Chukchi Sea, main center roughly southwest of Kivalina. So we got northwest winds coming down around that, turning westerly here, and then southwest flow, pretty good, 95 knots across the eastern interior, and good southwest winds also into the southern Panhandle. At 9,000 feet, 65 knot winds blowing across Yakutat into the Yukon there out of the southwest. About 55 knots there from roughly Eagle down across the eastern Alaska Range to Cordova, and 40 knots for the southern Panhandle to the west. Northerlies at about 50 knots there across or just east of the Pribilof Islands, followed by northwest winds at 50 knots. Northeasterlies 35 knots for the central Aleutians. 3,000 feet, we've got a polar low here tracking along or just south of the ice edge. Be a kind of a compact area of increased winds with that coming into the Pribilof Islands at about 40 to 50 knots. Otherwise, north-northeast 50 knots, Bristol Bay and the Aleutian Range, and pretty light over the interior areas. And the southeast coast looking at mostly southwest flow diminishing as it hits a coastline there up to 45 knots though. And turbulence-wise, light to isolated moderate turbulence, northern Panhandle to about Yakutat. We'll look for considerable moderate here, extending down across western Cook Inlet and the western Alaska Range, especially for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, northeast Bristol Bay, down across much of the Alaska Peninsula.